This is week 204 of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I'm Belokur, reporting to you from Kyiv, and this week, as temperatures across Ukraine continue to plunge well below freezing, we're going to talk about the dire winter conditions on the front lines. Now, last week, we dove into Russia's crippling attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Those attacks have continued throughout the week, with many residents here in Kyiv still without reliable electricity, heating, or even running water. Meanwhile, on the front lines, the war continues regardless. Commander-in-Chief Alexander Syrskyi on Monday described the situation in Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad as a grueling confrontation. Last December, Pokrovsk fell largely to Moscow's control, but despite Russian President Vladimir Putin's claims, Kyiv is still exacting a deadly toll on Russian troops in the city. Syrskyi went on to write that Russia is pulling reserves to Pokrovsk, looking for opportunities to break through our defense, both through sporadic massive assaults and more covert advances. Elsewhere north of Pokrovsk, in the city of Lyman, the joint forces reported that Russia is attempting to take the city through semi-encirclement. Russian forces are being slowed down by the Seversky Donetsk River, east of the city, which has not yet frozen enough for heavy equipment to cross and set the stage for mechanized assaults. This brings us to the topic at hand. What are we expecting to see as we now enter the peak of winter? Now, traditionally, winter has seen slower Russian advances, with offenses only gaining traction in spring and summer. But as seen here on the deep state map, in the first 2 years of the full-scale invasion, there were incremental gains between the start and end of winter. So in theory, winter poses an opportunity for advances with vehicles after the ground freezes. But first, the ground has to freeze. Over the past decade, Ukraine has seen one of the highest rates of temperature increase on the planet, particularly in winter, according to the Ukrainian Hydrometeorological Institute. While cold snaps persist, warmer winters have meant that snow melts faster and the soil remains muddy and soft. So absent the ground freezing, this muddy terrain can often be difficult or impossible to maneuver through, bringing any advance to a grinding halt. As we saw in Russia's initial invasion in 2022, their armored vehicles got stuck in what's called the bezdorezhya, which translates to roadlessness. Anyone who's driven through the region knows what this means. But in the last year, Russia occupied a sizable chunk of Ukrainian territory, with Moscow launching huge assaults in an attempt to take Ukrainian fortress cities like Pokrovsk. The question is then, what scenario are we likely to see play out this winter? Marginal gains, or something more substantial from either side? Well, it's not certain. Opportunistically, Russia has lately taken positions when and where it can, such as in Zaporizhia Oblast over the holidays. But generally speaking, Moscow has kept its focus centered on conquering the remainder of Donetsk Oblast, which Russian dictator Putin officially annexed in 2022, despite still not having full control over the oblast. In response to this fixation, Kyiv has concentrated several of its strongest brigades and drone units there to inflict the maximum cost possible on Russia, wearing down their manpower and equipment. If this remains true, we are unlikely to see drastic changes along the front in the winter. Yet, there's a growing threat posed by Ukraine's lack of manpower. New Russian offenses could potentially be launched into less guarded areas, such as in northern Sumy Oblast. Ukraine so far has made up for its lack of personnel through innovations, particularly with drones. One significant reason we see less movement during winter along the front is the lack of cover provided by tree lines and forests, making soldiers exposed out in the open easy targets. However, drones have their own vulnerabilities during cold weather. There's reduced visibility during fog, heavy winds and snow can impact their use, battery life is reduced, especially with consumer drones like Mavics. Those can find their operating capacity cut in half. And with fiber optic drones, which have become essential to bypassing electronic warfare, these cables can freeze and break. For more on how Ukrainian soldiers respond to such challenges, our journalist Tanya Mironishina visited a drone training ground to learn more.
We are now at a training ground near Kyiv where soldiers are flying interceptor drones that are designed to hunt down Shahed-type drones that Russia launches in mass at Ukrainian cities. both Shaheds and interceptors are new tools of this war that is constantly evolving. The latest challenge is extreme cold and the ongoing energy crisis. So we came here to see how Ukrainian soldiers learn to operate drones in winter conditions.
The -degree temperature make drones more fragile, exhaust battery more often, more intensive, and for sure being outside flying with all of this -degrees temperatures, that's just make you cold.
Ну, саме зима, якщо брати, наприклад, таку погоду, як зараз, то для нас це не критична погода, це погода достатньо комфортна для нас. Некомфортна погода більше це коли опади у нас. Тобто, коли опади, волога, от тоді вже у нас можуть бути невеличкі проблеми. Ну, єдине, що зараз на даний момент, це батареї, які ми маємо зберігати в теплі. І слідкувати, умовно кажучи, за обладнанням, щоб воно не перемерзало.
Ну, дрони страдають, тому що може замерзати, мотори можуть замерзати. Вони, умовно, наприклад, набрали вологи, потім їх винесли на мороз, вони просто примерзають. Ну, то фізично не крутяться. Тобто запускаєш дрон, а він не запускається, умовно. Приходиться відігрівати дрон, потім виставляєш його, і він поки тепленький, зразу запускаєш, а він тоді працює.
Ви кажете, що найважче – це холод. Типу, як ваш одяг зараз відрізняється?
Зверху куртки, штани, все утеплено.
А рукавички?
Рукавички є, але якщо умовно для керування дроном, я і не завжди їх використовую, бо воно трошки заважає, буває.
Що найважче – це пальці саме?
Мабуть, пальці. Просто якщо літати без рукавиць, без якихось обдувачів, умовно, без пічки, просто пальці не відчуваються на морозі.
It's unclear how long these freezing temperatures will continue, but these soldiers are preparing for any scenario. It's still training, it's not the front line, it's not a city under attack, but everything they learned here will soon be used in real conditions.
Такі от руки в хлопців з позиції.
An agonizing video posted this week on social media depicts the frozen hands of a Ukrainian soldier from the Pokrovsk direction. This is the hard reality that soldiers face.
Conditions on the front can already be quite grueling as is, but winter poses additional threats, like frostbite and hypothermia. This can be further dispiriting to an already exhausted military struggling with manpower shortages and inadequate rotations. Last week, new Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov acknowledged a concerning fact that 2 million Ukrainians are wanted for evading mobilization, and another 200,000 are believed to be AWOL, absent without official leave. Though it should be noted, many have gone AWOL as a shortcut, albeit illegal, around lengthy bureaucracy in order to transfer to other units, often in hopes of a better assignment or due to disagreement with commanders that they might deem reckless or incompetent. Regardless, infantry units have in particular a critical shortage of manpower after 4 years of intense fighting. And this is while the front line resembles less of a defined line and more of a Jackson Pollock paint splatter, with small units from both sides interspersed through a gray zone. Small groups of Russian troops can often be holed up in positions in front of and behind Ukrainian positions, and vice versa. Without frequent rotation, morale is particularly crucial in these conditions. It's also reported that the cold weather brings an increase in rodents to the dugouts in search of warmth. These creatures not only steal food, but can chew wires and damage equipment. And it's obviously not very pleasant. To see how Ukrainian defenders are managing in this brutal winter, several units actually shared with us footage from the front.
Що така у нас ранкова кава на дрібчиках. Заряджаємось енергією в ранкову зміну польотів. Не ріде?
Що одна батарея? Що ти хочеш?
Провозять нам не воду, а лід. І ще й трошки
Трошки пісяє пляшка. Ну нічого, буває. Зараз розтопимо через обігрівач.
Bom dia, eu sou voluntário brasileiro servindo no exército ucraniano. Eu ouvi falar sobre as condições que a gente está tendo nesse inverno. Aqui a sensação térmica está atualmente de menos 16 graus. A gente já passou por dias com sensação de menos 23, a média aqui gira em menos 12 de temperatura. E o que acontece é que não é por má vontade do exército, não é por má vontade da Ucrânia, e sim por logística complicada, pode-se dizer assim, porque é o seguinte, onde que eu estou, por exemplo, a gente acaba usando esse tipo de fornalha aqui para se aquecer, queimando o pedaço de pau que tem, onde acha, quebra as coisas que tem aqui de madeira para poder usar de lenha, se esquenta com o que pode, mas no geral, o que a gente recorre para usar é sleep bag e cobertor é o que a gente tem, isso não é suficiente aqui. E como está tendo um bombardeio, ataque da Rússia, etc., a gente está sem energia. A energia que tem é de gerador demanda gasolina não é uma coisa fácil de se levar de logística. Então, basicamente, o que a gente está tendo aqui é se virar como pode. O que mais sente são as extremidades com frio, você dói, tu perde a sensibilidade praticamente e não tem o que fazer. Tu se vira, tu aguenta o que tem aí e é basicamente o que está acontecendo e a situação que a gente está.
The Kyiv Independent is reader-funded, meaning that shows like this are only made possible by viewers like you. If you'd like to join our community of more than 25,000 members, there will be a link to our membership page in the description below. I'd also like to thank everyone who donates directly via YouTube. Your support is greatly appreciated. In June of 1812, French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte marched his Grande Armée, the largest European force of its time, into the Russian Empire. Infamously, when Napoleon seized Moscow that September, the Russians razed the city to the ground as they abandoned it. Experiencing sub-zero temperatures and depleted morale, the French army was not equipped to face the winter conditions. Of his 612,000 troops, only 112,000 returned from the war. In World War II, Hitler launched his invasion of the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, anticipating a quick victory. But by winter, his forces faded, as described earlier, with muddied roads and fatigued soldiers. As the German invaders approached Moscow in December, they recalled Napoleon's defeat. Furthermore, Hitler forbade any retreat, despite lack of winter clothing or equipment. By the end of winter, German divisions were reduced to a third of their original force. Now, I mention these anecdotes to emphasize how lethal every decision under this climate can be. Clothing is vital, but can be restrictive, as anyone knows when trying to use their phone with gloves on. Even actions as simple as taking a weapon from warmth, when it's inside, into the cold of outside, can cause condensation that then freezes and leads to malfunctions. Lubricants in the weapons can also thicken in lower temperatures. Conducting equipment repairs can also be more challenging in winter. There's also differences in Western versus Soviet-era equipment. Western vehicles use block heaters for cold starts in below-zero temperatures, whereas Soviet equipment rely on torch heaters. And the impacts aren't just on the ground. Long-distance drones going from above to below 0 degrees can find their wings frozen and their performance impaired. For more on winter combat, I'm joined by analyst Pasi Baranin from the Blackbird Group. Hi, Pasi. Thank you so much for speaking with us, and we can get right into it if that's okay with you. Could you just maybe paint a picture of what soldiers on the front are seeing, feeling, experiencing this winter specifically?
First of all, the winter is most likely cold, wet, muddy, and very unpleasant for any frontline fighter, as it has been the previous winters as well. The battlefield seems to be getting emptier and emptier as the both sides are kind of being forced to dilute their forces and separate units further and further apart. And there is like a lot more wider no man's land between the fighting forces. So it is no longer a case that the opposing side might be on the other side of the field and you're on the trenches on the other side.
What are some of the challenges, but also maybe even benefits of camouflaging movement in this sort of terrain, in this sort of weather?
During the winter time, especially, like the Russians are in part aided and also hindered by the winter conditions. They are aided in this term that the weather is quite often foggy or very heavily overcast. That was especially the case during the autumn period, and it clearly aided them in their infiltration attacks all across the front line. But of course, as we are now in the winter, the level of vegetation, the leaves are gone from the trees. So that in turn is a hindrance for the Russians. Also, of course, it is also a danger for the Ukrainian defenders, as the relatively sparse and few wooded areas offer even less and less protection for both sides at the moment.
We're still getting into the peak of winter, so it's hard to say, but what do you think will define this winter when we compare it to the previous ones? What is emerging about this winter as a specific challenge?
The Ukrainian home front is certainly getting hit especially hard, like the infrastructure strikes against the energy infrastructure all across the country is certainly going to affect things. But on the front line, for example, comparing to last year, there is no ongoing extreme crisis. When compared to last year, we had the Kursk salient being pressured very, very aggressively by the Russians, and ultimately it collapsed, if I remember, February. And then, of course, at the same time, the situation in Donbass was also deteriorating quite rapidly. Compared to that situation, the front line is, you can't say that it is stable. There are certain crisis spots, Lyman, for example, and also Hyakvola in the southern front. But nowhere does it seem like that the situation is getting out of hand rapidly. Certainly, one thing that comes to my mind that is interesting or developing new thing for this winter is the Ukrainian fortification effort or adjustments to it. That the Ukraine is now building new, I would say, more heavier obstacle belts all across the front line, and hopefully this will, let's say that this is a better use of the resources for fortification than maybe what has been done previously. Because we have seen that these anti-tank ditches coupled with barbed wire have been effective in limiting Russian infiltration and attack and making it easier to contain them. So that is something that I am looking for the next few months to see how this shift in doctrine is going to affect things.
This week's community question is from our member Kev H. Is anything being done to install an air defense system that works? I respect those that guard the skies, but if Russia can shut down 60% of the energy grid in 2 months, something is wrong. Well, I think it's first worth mentioning that this is an onslaught unlike anything any country has ever seen in history, coming up against an incredibly heavily armed enemy that is still constantly innovating and building up its capability to strike infrastructure at a long range, and also adapting and thinking about which substations, which power stations, what other facilities are most effective to knock out the energy grid. This is not normal to be given the task of trying to defend from it. Now, given the task at hand, of course, Ukraine does have a multi-layered air defense, and there is an asset that is designed to shoot every kind of incoming threat down. Here's the problem though. For some of what Russia shoots at Ukraine, especially the high-velocity ballistic missiles, the only thing that Ukraine can possibly shoot them down with are those advanced air defense systems, specifically the Patriot, which we all know is extremely limited stocks worldwide, and it's getting harder and harder to get them from a US administration that doesn't really want to help Ukraine. The rest of it is more interesting when we talk about the hundreds of drones per day that Russia fires. For a while, Ukraine came up with its own solution of the mobile fire groups using machine guns and spotlights and getting hundreds of these groups together to take on these daily drone attacks. But now, with Russia upping the scale of these drones and also adding jet engines to them, making them faster, harder to detect, Ukraine realizes that that is not enough and has been developing over 2025 and further into 2026 anti-drone intercept drones, specifically designed to fly out and intercept those Shahed-style drones in the air. The problem is that now Russia is adapting further and coming up with new models of cheap long-range weapons. These are drones that are starting to look more like cruise missiles that will be even harder to intercept without the use of expensive and limited ground-to-air missiles. This is a cat and mouse game that will continue, but unfortunately it's not as simple as just installing an air defense system. I wish I could do that.
That's all for this week. We'll be back next Sunday with more news from Ukraine. If you appreciated this video, please consider becoming a member of the Kyiv Independent community. It's truly thanks to viewers like you that we can do this work, even in these conditions, and we are so grateful for your support. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.